to the photography department to do a lecture tonight. Me and Brittany met like a few years ago at a creative capital retreat. We both got the grant at the same time, and we really hit it off. And I think we had to do this thing because we were incredibly nervous about doing public speaking. And we both like literally had earphones of music in the background before we got up to speak publicly. So look at us now, we're like public speaking. Okay, so I'm just gonna read Brittany's bio. So Brittany Nelson works with 19th century photographic chemistry techniques to address themes of feminist science fiction and queer abstraction. She received her MFA from photography from Cranbrook Academy of Art, and her Bachelor of Arts from Montana State University. She is the recipient of a 2015 Creative Capital Grant in Visual Arts and a Theo Westenberger Foundation Grant for advancing women in the arts. Select solo exhibitions include Patron Gallery in Chicago, Morgan Lehman in New York, David Klein Gallery here in Detroit, Sadie Halley Projects in Minneapolis, and Crush Curatorial in New York. Group exhibitions include Brooklyn Academy of Music in Brooklyn, New York, the Newcomb Art Museum in New Orleans, the Cranbrook Academy of Art Museum here in Bloomfield Hills, the Houston Center for Photography in Houston, Texas, and an upcoming exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit, MOCAD. Nelson was a 2017 artist in residence at the Headland Center of Arts, and her work has been featured in publications such as The New Yorker, Wired, Collector Daily, Aesthetica, and the New Art Examiner. She is currently based in Richmond and teaches at the University of Richmond. So put your hands together to welcome Brittany to the stage. Thank you.
Let me just lower that. Hi, thank you, Danielle. She didn't tell you the entire story. Before we had to do that, public speaking is really terrifying. They flew in 200 curators and gallerists to hear us talk. We had 5 minutes, and then we were supposed to ask for stuff. It was completely terrifying, but she asked me what I like to do before a talk, and I said I like to listen to Drake. And I asked her what she wanted to do, and she said, I want to stretch. And so we were listening to Drake and stretching in public before we spoke, so. Important details. But thank you. It's really great to be back when I'm not a grad student, because that shit was wild. It's a whole other scene here, but and not to get too sentimental, but I would like to say the only thing that got me through the 2 years I was here was the perpetual sale of Kroger brand champagne called Cristalino. So I'm going to dedicate this talk to Cristalino. This is what you get when you Google abstract photography. So I wanted to start with this. It's pretty amazing. You just got to zoom in on shit. Sometimes there are forks. I don't know why, there's always a lot of forks. But there's a lot of misconceptions about abstract photography. So, okay, speed dating for some of you I know already, but I like to start out this way and just kind of give you some context of where I came from and how I'm making work and sustaining myself. That's me. Okay, I am a graduate of the Academy, as Danielle mentioned, in 2011. My undergraduate degree is in photography and philosophy from Montana State. That does sound like a recipe for someone to die under a bridge, doesn't it? I'm from Montana. I lived there until I was 25 and was able to leave when I got into Cranbrook. And I grew up gay in Montana. That's what that photo is for. And I'm a first-generation college student, so I got $130,000 of student loan debt currently, so just throwing that out there for you guys. Solidarity, okay. Montana's very hard to get out of. Actually, it's a gigantic state. So you drive for 12 hours and then you just hit North Dakota. So it's just a little reminder that shit can get worse. Okay, so I want to start with this piece. This is a piece that I kind of credit as starting my career, which was my degree show piece here at Cranbrook, and I'm really proud that the Art Museum owns it. And I went back to Montana my summer between first and second year and worked photographing whitewater rafting. I was photographing tourists just like flying off of boats for money, and I saved up and I made like an incredibly expensive giant photograph. This is 6 by 6 feet. They told me I had 7 feet of space at the museum, so I made a 6 by 6 foot photograph, and I was like, done. But I kind of put literally every dollar I had into this photograph. I had like 79 cents, I remember specifically, in my checking account when I was done, and it was a big risk. It really paid off. The museum collected it, and then I started working with a fantastic gallery here, David Klein. Here's an install shot from that. But so just to give you an introduction about the general themes that I work on, which I'm going to touch on individually and then hopefully kind of bring it all together for you guys. But I'm interested in the parallels between photo history and science fiction. So my research is in feminist science fiction in particular. But my specialty technically is 19th century photographic processes. So for me, both of these things, photo history and science fiction, are tactics that are both reliant on technology to deliver their content in different ways, and as communication devices that transform the metaphorical into the literal. So an easy way to talk about science fiction is taking an idea and bringing it to its logical conclusion and see where you end up. So I'll also be speaking about the term that's being thrown around now more and more as queer abstraction, and specifically why queer artists are turning to abstraction. And in particular, I'm interested in why queer women are turning to this in photography specifically, and in other mediums in general. I think this term is largely discussed as to resist like the visual taxonomies through which the human body is recognized and regulated. And so that, of course, is an interesting topic of conversation coming from a traditional photographic background. And specifically for, the abstraction of the human form. So I think of my work as more of an intervention. I think of the current demographic of those in my specialty. So 19th century photography processes have seen a massive resurgence in the last decade, but it's exclusively, almost entirely all men working in these processes. And also what it means right now to resist the idea of legibility in an exclusively representational medium like photography. So I'm looking to a lot of women science fiction writers and their tactics of intervention, which is also a male-dominated practice in genre, and take that logic or framework and sometimes the visual cues. So some of these hopefully look a bit strange or alien. I think of these as landscape-like. But what I've been showing you as I'm speaking here is work from a series I started here at Cranbrook, and the idea is that it's ongoing forever. So I've been making these for I think 8 years now. There are several thousand of them, but I show about a dozen as large-scale prints. But what this is a process referred to as mordensage. It's a 19th century chemical process that was a negative reversal process. But essentially what it does is it reacts violently to the silver contained in darkroom paper. So it's copper chloride, glacial acetic acid, hydrogen peroxide, like mixed in this great cocktail. It's blue, it bubbles. It's very dramatic. And wherever there's silver in an image, so where there's black areas in a photographic image, it'll react violently to that and detach it from the gelatin layer. So that's what you see is the gelatin layer of the photographic paper coming detached and starting to slide off. They work with them very small. They're like 4 by 4 inches. And so what I do is I make black squares over and over and over again, sort of a la Joseph Albers. And run them through this chemistry. It's a bit scientific. It's about cataloging all of the variables capable within the process, which is why it needs to go on forever because the variables are endless. So I plan on hopefully never stopping this until, my studio is like a super fun site. So until I like get too poisoned to continue. Speaking of which, they do not make child-sized hazmat suits. So the paper, it's a pretty violent reaction. It's also the least archival thing you can imagine, which is funny because photographers in particular are very obsessed with this idea of things being archival, which is interesting because I don't really hear that being talked about in other mediums. There's very complicated archival ratings for papers, out there, digital papers and otherwise, rating specifically. This paper was tested to last 65 years under these conditions. It's a very interesting idea to be so concerned with the longevity, but at the same time, I enjoy this process because it's incredibly unstable. They change color as the scanner is running over them, and some of them have just turned to mud puddles in the archive. But selections of them are scanned at really high resolutions and turned into pretty large scale prints. And that's mostly so you can actually see the chemical reaction that's taking place. So it's like putting it under a microscope. So the scanner really had become my camera. I ended up selling all my camera equipment in grad school, and I gave up this idea of taking photos. It's like a very romantic idea to like wander around finding photographs to take, but it's also a hard idea to give up. So with the research in science fiction, I think with the work that's happened after this, that these really have been recontextualized as landscapes, which I like and have been thinking about more and more. And in terms of abstraction, I'm also thinking a lot about photographers, this influx of abstract photography and photographers that are working in it, and particularly borrowing this language of abstract expressionism, but as a veneer, though, they'll take the visual cues of it, but without all the politics, which is really interesting because, of course, abstraction has a deep history of being a very political act, but I think, like photography, which is the everyman's medium, abstract expressionism really is so ingrained in the fabric of our everyday that the politics have dropped away, and it's becoming like an unnoticeable factor where you can buy an abstract expressionist painting at Pier 1 Imports, which my mother has like 12. This is some older work. This is just to show you what the experiments look like as the full page without the square. Usually I'll cut the square out of the background in Photoshop just so you can see that boundary area, but some of them live on as just these experiment excerpts, which are these fairly large scale prints. So the more dense work is something I'm always sort of thinking about. It's always going on in the background. I'm consistently doing it. I keep pretty extensive notes. This is all black and white paper. You can make really interesting colors. It's tiny, tiny tweaks in the chemistry produce all of these results. So it's sort of an endless fascination going on in the background. So, okay, so I put in some like positive affirmations in case it wasn't going well or I felt nervous. So, really glad I did that. Okay, this is the Tintype. So the Creative Capital grant that Danielle mentioned that we both received in 2015. I wrote that grant to explore the Tintype photographic process, particularly because it had seen a big resurgence. And there were Tintype, like novel Tintype portrait studios popping up all over the place, mostly Portland. And that was a joke, but no, really, Portland. And I really wanted to explore it. Oh, I'm sorry, I'll go back. This is a Tintype. This is a traditional Tintype. So it's a Civil War era process. It was invented in the 1850s. Most of the Tintypes you'll see in the archive any archive are probably from 1860s and 70s. And they're almost exclusively portraiture with some exception of landscape photography. And the contemporary tintype is also almost exclusively portraiture, which is really easy. Freudian slip, I said it's really easy, which is really interesting that it's still all portraiture. So it felt like the right time to investigate this process, why it's popping up. And like the Mortensage, I encourage you guys to all Google Mortensage because you're gonna get some really amazing, really kitschy things. That I really liked how novel this process was, and thinking about why it's become resurrected. So I started working with the tintype and trying to revise it in a few different ways, content-wise and also chemically, how they're constructed. So for one, I didn't read any tintype manuals, which is a terrible, terrible idea. It's a very complicated process. You take a metal plate and you coat it in a collodion, which is like a skin-like material, and soak it in silver nitrate, expose it usually in a camera. I don't use a camera, I use a darkroom and an enlarger. And you have to hand develop it and fix it. And every slight movement that you make while making this plate will leave a mark. So there's a huge margin of error in creating these plates. But the surface of them, it's a fake positive. So what they do is when you take a photograph of it, it's really a negative, but you put it on a black background and it looks like a positive. This is partially why everyone looks so scary when you see them in tintypes. And ghostly. The other factor is super long exposures. And so I was really interested in reworking the chemical aspect of the tintype because this resurgence, the tintype had been resurrected almost completely untouched from whence it was in the 1850s. And so this begged the question a bit of this perpetuation of tradition in photography and this logic maybe in resurrecting things exactly as they were, and this lack of experimentation with a highly experimental process. So that led me to start to make some of these abstract forms. So I created them in the 3D tool in Photoshop. So I took the square from the Mortensage experiments and rendered it in 3 dimensions, and created a system of digital negatives that were printed out and built what could only be described as contraptions, a lot of PVC and duct tape, and created a way to expose an inkjet printed negative onto a tintype and have it be perfectly translated from the screen. And here's just what one looks like. The surface changes if you've never seen one in person. The surface is really, really different depending on what angle you're at. It's very, very metallic. I mean, it's literally metallic silver sitting on an aluminum plate. So before you guys get seasick, I'll change it. But that GIF will factor in a little bit later. So I started to create these tintypes and really think about what this material possesses that other photographic materials don't to justify its use. And the big thing is that the tonal range is metallic silver. It's really spectacular, actually. And so I was pulling from ideas of alien artifacts, or pop culture's, of course, ideas of alien artifacts, because they're not real. I'm sorry to break the news. But we know exactly what they're supposed to look like. It's my favorite Google search. It's always an object that's metallic, has some kind of glyph system inscribed on it, is like geometric in nature, and the glyph system has some sort of organization enough that gives you the visual cues. That's something that could be deciphered or read. So I've been looking at a lot of pop culture, alien artifacts, watching all of the movies my father likes, and pulling some things from these to construct there's a bit of an internal logic. As the tintypes get bigger, the squares, or monoliths, if you will, is like a really blatant, like 2001 floating monolith thing going on. The squares multiply, or they start to cast shadows as they get bigger and bigger. This tintype is 20 by 24 inches, which is very big. It's considered a mammoth plate. Normally they're about 4 by 5 inches. When you get up to 8 by 10, that's considered a very large tintype, and I started to make bigger and bigger ones. I have not made the world's largest. I got close. I kind of want to make the world's largest because I really hate the guy who did make it, but I don't know if it's like worth it or not. I don't know. You guys need to tell me if I should do it or not, just to be an asshole, but I'm kind of thinking about it. Should I do? Okay. Peer pressure. The biggest I've made is 30 by 40, which is, for a tintype, I don't want to brag, that's fucking huge. But I think, I don't know, it's like a person-sized, well, not my size, but like a regular person-sized one. I could do it, but I just don't know if I want to do it just to say I have the biggest one, because that's what that person did, and I'm going to do it. Okay. This is an install shot from this, sorry, what was this show called? It was called The Year I Made Contact at Morgan Lehman, and the Mordensage work I installed with the tintypes, but just to show you what started to happen with the tintypes is I had these wedges manufactured. I was thinking of a display tactic for them, and most of the contemporary ones are actually being framed, and putting them behind glass or in some sort of case seemed really counterintuitive to what was happening with the surface. And the surface of mine are exceptionally shiny, so going back to this idea of not using the tintype manual, is the manuals are written to get from point A to point B, and there's a very specific logic for that. And point B would be a clean portrait of a sitter, right? So nothing that interrupts the picture plane. And in between there's a whole host of things that are, mistakes or failures, which are incredibly beautiful. But if you do a tintype correctly, so to speak, you're supposed to skip all of that. So what I did is just fumble my way through it and see what would happen and what went wrong, and then try and reverse engineer some of the mistakes. Because when you're not working with a portrait, right, or representational image, then everything sort of opens up, so you can kind of rework the logic of the chemistry from the ground up. So that was a big part of this work. These wedges that they're placed on, when you stand directly in front of them, they're a tiny bit smaller, so they're meant to drop away. So these tintypes hopefully kind of look like these kind of hatches opening in the wall. But from the side, you can see them, and part of it was I was showing them in talks as animated GIFs, and I was thinking about a way to mimic that as an actual object. Tintypes were also never meant to be for the wall. They were always these handheld objects that you carried around with you, so it felt appropriate to make them object-like again. But I was thinking about the animated GIF and wanted to recreate that for the wall, so I ended up having these really simple steel-formed powder-coated wedges made that were tipped at different angles, top to bottom, left to right, at different heights. Just a huge variety of them, in order to tip the tintypes up to catch the light differently in the spaces and kind of mimic what was happening with the animated GIF in the way that I was exhibiting them. The other thing is thinking about the set design for films like Solaris. It's how few moves can you get to science fiction, and if something's white in a wedge shape, it's you're there, right? And it was sort of a very simple, easy move, but it worked. Everyone, the reviews is everyone was writing about science fiction, and that's really interesting, actually. A thing to think about is this, the geometry involved and just these really basic things. But again, it's how few moves does it take to get to science fiction? This would be an example of a failure tintype, a failed tintype. It's very, very foggy. This is a bad batch of silver nitrate, but I made this on purpose, took all the iodide out of the silver nitrate, and you get these really beautiful, the silver collects in the surface of them. So if you were doing a portrait, this would obviously be a disaster, or most photographers would think it's a disaster, but you get these really beautiful mirror qualities that start to happen with some of this work. So part of this project was also that I started to receive angry emails. It was completely surprising, right? From some Tintype masters, and one really amazing email. It was 10 pages long. I decided to share this with you guys because we're all friends here, right? From a really prominent archivist at a major photo institution, and they were very mad about this work. And I think it's really funny because it's like a bunch of squares. It's like really innocuous. But I got all of these emails, and what I did is I made you something. I made you some haikus out of their emails. I hope that you like them. But it was very interesting, I'll say. So they were angry emails, and of course I was like completely livid when I first read them, because there's all these guys like telling me I don't know what I'm doing, and I was like, wah! And then after I calmed down, like a year later, I started to look at the language that they were using, and it's actually really, really fascinating, and I think really telling about photography. So I've really been thinking about how conservative values like play out in photography. And I really think it's because it's the everyman's medium, and in photography in general, you just see a wider cross-section of the population participating than, say, other mediums like sculpture. This is just a hypothesis. But anyways, I bring you my haikus from various wet plate experts. I am guessing that you've never read my basic collodion manual. Again, these is totally unsolicited emails. It's kind of amazing. And I had not read this guy's basic collodion manual. I really, really didn't. This one's really good. Serendipity is a very inefficient way to make art. Making clean photos with a wide range of tones is hard. I stopped listening. Yeah. So, I don't know if I can talk anymore about the emails because now the anger is returning a bit, but it was very interesting, right? Especially with this, and I can't help but think that because of the Civil War era process, that a lot of tintypists that are out there, and I live in Virginia right now, there's are also Civil War reenactors, and there's like this very interesting like crossover that's happening with the history and this resurrection, but also in photography again, and who's making these things, who's writing the books for these things, and why it angers them so much to, what I say is like queered it up, and they got really uncomfortable with what I was doing. Here's just a front side view. Some of them play off early astronomical photography. There's astronomer Sir John Herschel, who discovered a few planets in the solar system, but also was the inventor of some major photography processes like the cyanotype, also known as the blueprint, and the salt printing process, which is a very important early photo process. But the discovery of planets would occur by taking images of the night sky, like poor quality, obviously, on plates, and looking at the pinpoints of light and really meticulously comparing them and trying to see if the light dims anywhere to denote the road, a planet orbiting and dimming the light of a star is a very meticulous process. So some of these tintypes that have this like basic comparison or this like movement that's happening, thinking about these sorts of things. This is just an installation shot. These are some tintypes done on silver instead of black, which is not really a crazy thing, but again, angry emails. So with this process, the real chore was how to circumvent the nostalgia of it. It just looks nostalgic, like no matter what you do with it. There's this heavy element of nostalgia just embedded in it. So a lot of these choices were about, okay, can I project this material into the future instead of being nostalgic for the past? So some of the references and the space references, the wedges, so on and so forth, became an easy way to do that and kind of unhinge it from a very specific timeline. Okay, I'm just gonna touch on this project really quick just to follow up on the wedges. This is a book I did with Small Editions, which was founded by a Cranbrook grad, Karina Reynolds, and we had discussed this for a while. We made an object that's also a book. There's only 3 of them made because she couldn't stand making them, and it took forever. But we constructed this limited edition book that are these wedge forms, and the book kind of rotates and moves as you go through it. And there's some really like basic landscape references, how few moves you need to get to a landscape. So the first half of the book is the sky, if you will, and the second half is the ground. And these are handmade prints in the darkroom, using the technique that fuses the silver to create mirrors. And this book was also in conjunction with an installation that happened at an artist-run space called Sadie Halley Projects. And they were in Brooklyn and moved to Minneapolis. They have a garage. And after the Creative Capital Grant, I got a lot of interest in galleries. And this was maybe my favorite thing I had done in years, because it was really great to do something where a show where no one's trying to commodify your works. It's like, what would you do if no one is watching, right? And so I had this floor built in their garage space that was about, I think the highest rise of it was about 2 feet up. It was a pretty significant slant of the floor, and created this installation. At the top of the floor, you would reach a tintype. It's like, here's a shot of the floor. So this is called Monuments to the Conquerors of Space. It's a play off, there's an actual Soviet monument called that. The Soviets sent the first woman into space 20 years ahead of the US. And also a bit of like a Russian constructivist formalist joke. And this installation was, these are made in the darkroom, by the way. Using the parts of, I physically disassembled the enlarger and used the parts of it, the metal parts of it, to create these shapes. So I kind of consider these drawings, it's kind of something I do just to kind of get going when I'm in the darkroom. And we ended up thinking of them as like these monuments, or these like these very geometric Soviet monuments, and creating them in this garage. So the book and the installation all went hand in hand. Oh, this is good. This is working. Okay, so this is the newest work. And now I'm going to talk about things I've been doing just the last year. So this is a project called And I Awoke and Found Me Here on the Cold Hillside, which is taken from a Keats poem, but it's also the name of a short science fiction story by an author called James Tiptree Jr., which I'm going to talk a lot about now. I removed the pages from this story, physically removed them from the binding of the book, and exposed them with a flashlight in the darkroom on gelatin silver paper. So this story is, I've been working with this author a lot. So James Tiptree Jr. was really a woman named Alice B. Sheldon, and she lived in upstate Virginia. And she wrote very feminist science fiction, mostly published in the 70s, and wrote under a male pen name, obviously, to get published. She's a really interesting figure. She was briefly in the CIA, and she died. She shot her husband and then killed herself. It looks like it was a mercy killing. You didn't need to know that. I just put a downer on this. But she had a few different alter egos, and she had 3 different typewriters, each with different colored ink. And she would, had one color for Tiptree, one color for Alice, and she had another alter ego that wrote science fiction named Raccoona Sheldon. So these stories are some of the most feminist, amazing things I've ever read, and was really blown away by, especially the time that they were published. And I started really looking into Tiptree. So this story in particular is important because she writes under a male pen name, but also using male narrators. So in this way, she's able to talk about her own closeted sexuality, but she has to insulate herself twice in order to do it, these male voices. And once she gets there, then she has this freedom. But in amongst that, she also uses these really direct metaphors for her own gay desires, where she projects them onto literal, in the stories, aliens. And so back to this idea of queer abstraction, or how do you talk about these kinds of desires without depicting actual gay eroticism? And this is the way that Tiptree did it. So I'm really looking to her in terms of how she was able to do this, her the logic she used, the structures, like, can I do the same thing that Tiptree did in a photograph? I don't know, but it's been a great interest. So in this story, And I Awoke and Found Me Here on a Cold Hillside, the title's from a Keats poem, which is about a sailor who's like sexed up by a fairy woman and like left alone on the cold hillside. And the story, the Alice B. Sheldon or Tiptree story, is essentially the same thing. A reporter visits a space captain on a ship and is trying to interview him, and the captain warns him that they've all become very sexually obsessed with aliens, and to get out while you still can, kid. And it's a really interesting that aliens just like routinely reject them, and they're all literally strung out. Like she describes them as heroin addicts almost. And I found this to be really poignant, again, of what she was talking about, and what she wasn't able to say as Alice in the 70s, but could say as Tiptree through that voice. So I removed the pages from the book and place them on photo paper, and just really simple process, expose them with a flashlight so you can see the front and the back of the page simultaneously. So it becomes a bit abstracted, but you can catch pieces of the text here and there. But became, searching through it, looking at it as a physical object, like literally looking through it with the light, and trying to dissect this story. She's such a mysterious figure too. I just feel like I've been kind of chasing her a bit and trying to figure out how she worked and operated. But as James, she had this freedom that the female-bodied Alice of like the 60s and 70s didn't have. But a bit of making these feels like also very much like a kid hiding like under a blanket with a Playboy and like a flashlight. So there's that element too with the flashlight exposure. So there's 6 prints, and they make up the entirety of the story, and that's it. They're one of a kind prints. So there's an element of serendipity in here. But in this way, I think that that when she's sort of projecting her current desires into this speculative futuristic landscape, that it was really not this form of escapism. I think it was a really calculated structure to avoid her present moment. I like to think of it as a time machine. She kind of projected herself into a different future in order to play out certain kinds of things, which again I think is really different than escapism. And here's an installation. So I wanted to, this is only 500 words. I wanted to read you guys something that I was asked to commission an essay for Parsons for their MFA catalog just recently. And they gave me a couple artists to write about, and they were, of course, abstract photographers. And I wasn't sure what I wanted to write about the work, and I was watching a lot of the Twilight Zone, the original Twilight Zone from the 50s, because I have this thing for Rod Serling. He's like so amazing. So I was going to try and outline better some of my arguments for abstraction. I thought I would just read this thing. It's only 500 words, so it was a bit of a challenge because I wanted to see if I could make an argument and for abstraction. So I started to use typical photo theory Roland Barthes and compare it to Stanislaw Lem's Solaris and try and do it in only 500 words. And so it's meant to read really kind of rapid fire like Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, where it's just like direct statement after statement, and hopefully it's a bit funny. And then I also was attempting here to keep all of like the art theory speak in just the titles of the sections and nowhere else in this reading. So, I guess before I start, two things if you haven't seen Solaris. It's a book by Stanislaw Lem. It's also a film by Tchaikovsky, which is amazing, but very long. And there's also a George Clooney remake by Soderbergh, but I think it's kind of great. But people hate it. It's very romantic. But the synopsis is that some scientists are on an orbiting spacecraft, and they're studying a sentient being, and that being is actually a planet, it's an ocean, and they're trying to figure out how to communicate with it, and they can't. And then the ocean finally does communicate with them, but it manifests itself in the form of the main character's wife who committed suicide, and so he's having like this bizarre experience. And then to give you a rundown of Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida, which is like the photo theory text, Barthes compares all of photography to death, and he uses two terms, the studium and punctum. A cultural interpretation of a photograph would be the studium, and the punctum is supposed to be that detail that personally wounds you or touches you about a photograph. So just some forethought. Okay. So let me read this to you very briefly. Okay, Roland Barthes describes a photographic image as that which inherently possesses death. Barthes details the interpretation of the image in two terms, the studium and the punctum. I would tell you more, but it is important to know that no one uses these terms or cares to anymore. Stanislaw Lem describes an oceanic planet called Solaris. It is a sentient being, and scientists are sent there to establish contact. The events of Solaris unfold as a Barthesian theater. Lem takes the idea of the image as Barthes describes it to its literal and logical conclusion. I will now describe this to you in the second person, whether you would like me to or not. Okay, the inevitable experience of abstraction, the studio in a vacuum. Blah. You travel to a space station and try to speak with the ocean below. The ocean is an organism. You try your best to communicate. You gargle at the ocean, and the ocean gargles back at you. You cannot understand it if there is anything to understand, so you continue to stare at it. The work is not necessarily unpleasant, but it provides you with no answers. The ocean absorbs your thoughts, but does not reflect them back. It can be whatever you like. This is very boring. Progress is the measure of movement. The ocean continues to gargle, unintelligible, intelligently indecipherable, and in possession of all possibility. It is unhinged from linearity, and that is only novel for so long. So you decide to shoot a big X-ray at it. An X-ray can show you how something works. You beg for confrontation under the guise of progress. Confrontation often feels like progress. The ocean decides to respond, and it speaks to you in a language you recognize. You find this horrifying. The referential image and the uncanny confrontation. Your dead lover appears on your spaceship. Barthes would describe this as a punctum, but you would describe this as a punishment or a haunting. A haunting is the idea that someone appears to you outside of the linearity of time. She appears, and not just to you, anyone can see her. An image is something indexical of an instant, but continues to exist outside of that instant. She is an image. She is composed from your memories. You both know she isn't your lover. You are fearful you remembered her wrong. She sleeps in your bed, and her sweat is real. She asks you questions in words that comprise your own thoughts, and you answer yourself. The image is death straining for life. A preservation or a failed resurrection, she stiffly dances to your memories. You decide to shove her in a rocket, and you hope that it is over. You cannot separate your experience from the image. The literalness of her form is both a comfort and an insanity. With specificity comes personal confrontation, and you've concluded that this is just far too specific. You've decided the gargle and its refusal to concretize itself has more interesting politics. You wish to return to the gargling. Let me skip over these. That, in short, is why I like abstraction. Also, I think I was at peak sadness when I wrote that. I'll just quickly show you this last project. It's called Warm Worlds and Otherwise. It's up right now at the Harnett Museum in Richmond, Virginia. It's a collaboration with a sound artist, a Venezuelan-American artist from living in San Francisco, Denishta Rivero. I took this image from one of the Mars rovers, Opportunity. So I've been working a lot with images from this particular rover. It was sent in 2004 to Mars with a twin Spirit. They were dropped at opposite sides of Mars, never to meet up. And both rovers were only supposed to last 90 sols, and a sol is a Martian day. It's about 37 minutes longer than an Earth day. And this rover celebrated a few months ago its 5,000th day on the planet. So it was supposed to last 90 days, and it made it 14 years. Spirit made it quite a bit longer than scheduled time, 7 years. But there's this really romantic, it ends up sounding like a very romantic story of these twin rovers being dropped on the planet, persevering, then Opportunity's twin dies, and it's left alone wandering on the planet. So the JPL has used its resources to take these really incredible photos of the rover, looking back at its own tracks. It's been an unscheduled mission for 14 years. So they've had to just keep devising explorations for it. So it's made it quite a bit farther than it was ever supposed to. And they've gotten really romantic. So they keep documenting these things. So on its 5,000th day, they took this photograph of the sunrise on Mars, and this is my version of it. And it was really widely circulated on the internet. So I took that and I've made it into darkroom prints and put it through this chemical process that fuses the silver together to make solid silver. So kind of like casting, I think it was like sculptural casting, but with paper, making this thing permanent. And I made them obsessively over and over again. I made a few hundred of them and then showed 20 of them. So they're slightly different. Like the Mortensage work, they have slight variation in color casts. But just to get to the idea of the monotony of being on this planet, wandering alone for this long, and seeing that sunrise over and over and over again. What's really interesting about the rover, though, my favorite thing is that they only refer to the rover in female pronouns. And so she's become a gay icon for me. And this has nothing to do with growing up gay in Montana. Nothing. I don't know why you would think that. And so it's become this image of perseverance, and people have really personified this rover. And I don't know if there's any nerds out there, but the rover has been down since June in a big dust storm. They've lost contact with her, and people have been sending electronic postcards and all of these things. So it's not just me who's overly personified this rover. But the prints are only visible if there's a lot of light shown on them. So in this installation in particular, the spotlights are part of the piece. And I lit the show first and then hung the photographs in the show, so did it in reverse. And so as the light falls away, the photographs do as well, and they turn into solid mirrors the farther they are from the bright light. So there's a bit of a large installation element. There's a accompanying sound piece and performances that happen from Denishta Rivero for this exhibition. And so I've been working a lot with this imagery of the Mars rover and really thinking about this idea, making this rover a gay icon. And I think I'm about out of time. I'm supposed to tell you that there's an opening at Forum Gallery right after this that you need to go to. Okay, thank you very much.